welcome to the channel. Before we step into the time machine and travel back to the cold, grey London of January 1969, I have a small request. If you believe that rock and roll was at its best when it was dangerous, unpredictable, and impossible to control, then you are in the right place. We are building a community here for those who remember the feedback, the analog warmth, and the legends who walked among us. So, please, take a second to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. It helps us keep these stories alive against the algorithm, just like Jimmy fought against the machine. Now, let's head into the BBC studios. The red light is on, but the script is about to burn. The sky over West London was the color of a bruised plum. It was January 4, 1969, a Saturday, and the biting wind whipping around the circular concrete fortress of the BBC television centre in White City carried with it the distinctive chill of a decade that was growing old and bitter. The swinging 60s, with its Technicolor optimism and Carnaby Street swagger, was effectively over. In its place, a harder, colder reality was settling in. The Beatles were on the verge of disintegration, the Rolling Stones were descending into darkness, and the utopian dream of the summer of love had been washed away by bad acid and political violence. Inside the television center, affectionately and derisively known as the Donut, the atmosphere was hermetically sealed against the chaos of the outside world. This was the cathedral of the British establishment, a place where culture was rationed out in polite, manageable doses. The corridors smelled of floor wax, canteen tea, and cigarette smoke. Men in grey suits walked briskly with clipboards, adhering to a schedule that was as rigid as a military operation. Here, entertainment was a product, manufactured on an assembly line. You arrived, you stood on your mark, you smiled when the red light went on, and you left. Unpredictability was not just discouraged, it was treated as a technical error. Into this mausoleum of light entertainment walked James Marshall Hendrix. By early 1969, Jimmy was trapped in a paradox. To the world, he was the wild man of Borneo, the guitar-burning shaman who copulated with his amplifiers and summoned feedback from the gods. He was the highest-paid act in rock, a deity draped in velvet and gypsy scarves. But internally, the man behind the sunglasses was exhausted, spiritually bankrupt, and profoundly bored. The relentless touring machine built by his management had ground him down. He was tired of the clown act. He was tired of smashing guitars. And more than anything else in the world, he was tired of playing Hey Joe. Hey Joe was the song that had broken him in England 2 years prior. It was a standard folk blues number, catchy and safe. But for Jimmy, it had become a prison cell constructed of 3 chords. Every night, in every city, the audience demanded it. They didn't want to hear the complex, underwater symphonies he was hearing in his head, they didn't want the jazz fusion experiments he was toying with in soundcheck. They wanted the hit. They wanted the monkey to dance. On this particular Saturday, the burden felt heavier than usual. The Jimi Hendrix Experience, Jimmy, bassist Noel Redding, and drummer Mitch Mitchell, had been booked to appear on Happening for Lulu, a primetime variety show hosted by the bubbly, wholesome Scottish pop singer Lulu. The demographic was families, grandmothers knitting on sofas, fathers drinking tea, and children waiting for the cartoons. It was the antithesis of everything Jimmy represented. The producers viewed him as a novelty act, a pop star, to be slotted in between a comedy sketch and a dance troupe. They had no concept of the sonic violence he was capable of unleashing. They had allocated him a strict time slot, perform the new single, Voodoo Child, engage in a scripted, light-hearted interview with Lulu, and then close the show with Hey Joe. But there was another shadow hanging over the studio that day, one that the BBC producers were entirely oblivious to. Just weeks earlier, Cream, the supergroup comprised of Eric Clapton, Jack Bruce, and Ginger Baker, had played their final farewell concert at the Royal Albert Hall. For the general public, it was just a band breaking up. For Jimmy, it was a seismic shift in the tectonic plates of his universe. Eric Clapton was the only peer Jimmy truly acknowledged. When Jimi first arrived in London in 1966, his primary goal had been to meet Clapton. They had circled each other like heavyweight boxers, developing a friendship based on mutual awe and the shared isolation of genius. Cream was the only other band on the planet that played at the same volume, with the same improvisational ferocity, as The Experience. Their breakup signaled the end of an era. It was a reminder of the fragility of bands, of how ego and industry pressure could destroy even the most powerful musical chemistry. Jimi felt a deep, melancholic need to pay tribute to his fallen comrades. He wanted to salute them, not with a press release, but with noise. However, the BBC run sheet had no column for tributes. The producer, Stanley Dorfman, was a man who lived by the clock. The news was scheduled for shortly after 6 p.m. The show had to end exactly on time to allow for the seamless transition to the newsreader. There was no margin for error, no room for sentimentality. The afternoon rehearsal offered the first hint of the friction to come. The studio, Studio 4, was a cavernous space filled with cameras the size of small cars and lighting rigs that generated enough heat to bake bread. The Experience set up their gear on a small, circular rostrum. Jimi's roadies wheeled in the Marshall stacks, towering monoliths of black vinyl and grill cloth. The BBC sound engineers, men in white lab coats who were used to recording orchestras and polite crooners, looked at the equipment with undisguised horror. "Could you turn it down, please?" one engineer asked over the talkback system during the soundcheck. "The needles are hitting the red." Jimi, standing on the stage with his white Fender Stratocaster slung over his shoulder, looked up at the control booth. He adjusted a knob on his amplifier, turning it up, not down. He wasn't being difficult, he was explaining physics. You couldn't get that sound, the sustain, the controlled feedback, the cry of the universe, at a polite volume. The amp needed to be pushed to the breaking point. The band ran through Voodoo Child. Even at half power, it rattled the lighting fixtures. Then came Hey Joe. Jimi played it with a lethargy that bordered on contempt. He mumbled the lyrics. He didn't look at the cameras. He treated the song like a dirty rag he was forced to hold. The producers, watching from the gallery, exchanged worried glances. "He looks stoned," one whispered. "He looks bored," said another. "As long as he plays the hit on time, I don't care if he's asleep," the director concluded. Back in the dressing room, a sterile, beige box with a mirror surrounded by light bulbs, the atmosphere was tense. The air was thick with the sweet smell of hashish, a direct violation of BBC policy, but nobody dared to knock on the door. Jimi sat in the corner, tuning and retuning his guitar. Mitch Mitchell, the drummer with the face of a cherub and the hands of a jazz demon, was drumming on his knees with a pair of sticks. Noel Redding, hiding behind his wire-rimmed glasses and frizzy hair, looked sullen. The band's internal dynamics were fraying, they were drifting apart, much like Cream had. But in this moment, facing the absurdity of the Lulu show, they found a common enemy, the script. "We're not playing Hey Joe," Jimi said softly, almost to himself. Mitch stopped drumming. "What are we playing then, boss?" Jimi looked up, a mischievous glint returning to his eyes for the first time that day. He played a riff on his unplugged guitar. Da-da-da, da-da. Mitch grinned. A wide, conspiratorial grin. "Sunshine?" For Eric, Jimi nodded. "We'll play Voodoo Child, we'll do the talk with the girl, and then when they ask for Hey Joe, we give them the thunder." They knew what it meant. It meant sabotaging a live national broadcast. It meant burning a bridge with the most powerful broadcaster in Britain. It meant chaos. And for three musicians who were bored out of their minds, chaos sounded like the most beautiful thing in the world. Upstairs, in the control room, the producer checked his stopwatch. 5 minutes to air, he announced. "Get them to their places. And tell Hendrix to smile." The stage was set. The trap was laid. But the BBC didn't realize that they weren't the ones holding the key. At exactly 6 p.m., the red tally light on camera 1 flickered to life. The signal beamed out from the transmission tower at Crystal Palace, carrying the image of Lulu, petuta, energetic, and dressed in the height of 1969 pop fashion, into millions of living rooms across the United Kingdom. To the viewer at home, eating their Saturday dinner of meat and 2 veg, everything looked normal. The opening dance sequence was bright and cheery. The studio audience applauded on cue, guided by the frantic hand signals of the floor manager. It was the perfect picture of British light entertainment, safe, predictable, and aggressively cheerful. But on the small performance stage in the corner, a dark storm front was gathering. Jimi Hendrix stood amidst the glitter, looking like a visitor from a different galaxy. He wore a crushed velvet suit that seemed to absorb the studio lights rather than reflect them. His afro was a halo of defiance. While the dancers pirouetted, Jimi checked his tuning one last time, his movements languid and predatory. He wasn't smiling. He was waiting. And now, Lulu announced with her trademark Scottish lilt, beaming at the camera, the Jimi Hendrix Experience. The band launched into Voodoo Child, Slight Return. Immediately, the audio levels in the control room spiked into the danger zone. This wasn't the polite pop of the Hermits or the Hollies. This was a sonic assault. The famous wah-wah pedal intro sounded like a gargling demon, a guttural, choking sound that seemed to physically rattle the expensive cameras. As the main riff kicked in, Jimi stomped on his fuzz box. The sound was thick, muddy, and overwhelmingly loud. In the control gallery, the sound engineers were fighting a losing battle. They scrambled to ride the faders, trying to compress the dynamic range of a Marshall stack into the narrow frequency band of a television broadcast. But you couldn't compress Jimi. The feedback bled into the vocal microphones. The drums were crashing with a violence that made the VU meters dance frantically in the red. Down on the floor, the polite audience sat frozen. They weren't dancing, they were staring, mesmerized and slightly terrified. Jimi played with his eyes closed, lost in the squall, ignoring the cameras that orbited him like sharks. He was sweating now, the heat of the lights mixing with the adrenaline of the looming sabotage. As the last note of Voodoo Child rang out, a long, sustaining howl of feedback that Jimi abruptly cut off with a chop of his hand, the script called for the interview. This was the moment the BBC loved, humanizing the monster. Making the rock star seem harmless and chatty. It was excruciating. Lulu, ever the professional, tried to bridge the gap. She bounced over to Jimi, microphone in hand. The height difference alone was comical. She looked up at him, he looked down at her from behind his aviator shades, his expression unreadable. "That was really loud," she chirped, a nervous laugh escaping her lips. Jimi mumbled something incoherent, a soft, yeah, that barely registered on the mic, so, she pressed on, sticking to the cue cards, "You're going to play your hit for us next, aren't you? Hey Joe?" This was the trap. The BBC needed him to say, "Yes, Lulu, we love that song." They needed him to be the compliant entertainer. Jimi paused. The silence stretched for a second too long, creating a vacuum of tension that the producer upstairs felt in his gut. "We're gonna play something," Jimi said finally, a cryptic half-smile playing on his lips. Lulu, missing the subtext, turned to the camera. "Ladies and gentlemen, playing their hit, Hey Joe, the Jimi Hendrix Experience." The band started, Hey Joe. It was the perfect Trojan horse. The familiar, walking bassline that Noel Redding had played 1,000 times began to thump. Mitch Mitchell fell into the steady, rolling beat. The backing vocalists, the Breakaways, a trio of session singers hired by the BBC, stepped up to their microphones, ready to provide the buzz and ayahs. Up in the gallery, the producer, Stanley Dorfman, exhaled. "Okay, we're good," he told the director. "He's playing the hit. 3 minutes and 30 seconds to the news. Perfect." The cameraman zoomed in on Jimmy's face. He was singing the opening lines, "Hey Joe, where you goin' with that gun in your hand?" But he wasn't really singing. He was reciting. He was throwing the words away, mocking them. He sounded bored, disgusted even. And then, at the 1-minute mark, the pivotal moment arrived. The Trojan horse opened its belly. Jimmy stepped back from the microphone. He stopped playing the rhythm guitar. The band, sensing the signal, began to falter intentionally. The backing vocalists looked at each other, confused. Why had he stopped singing? Was his equipment broken? Jimmy looked over his shoulder at Mitch Mitchell. Mitch was already grinning, his sticks raised high, ready for the transition. Jimmy turned back to the microphone. He didn't look at the camera, he looked past it, into the void. "I'm gonna stop playing this rubbish," he slurred into the mic. The word hung in the air. Rubbish. He had just called his biggest hit, and by extension, the show, the network, and the audience's taste, garbage. Live on national television. "And dedicate a song to the Cream," he continued, his voice gaining a sudden, sharp clarity. "Regardless of what kind of group they may be in. I'd like to dedicate this to Eric Clapton, Ginger Baker, and Jack Bruce." Before the floor manager could wave his arms, before Lulu could gasp, before the producer could shout, "Cut," Jimmy's left hand flew up the fretboard. Da-da-da, da-da, da-na-na. It hit the room like a physical blow. The opening riff of "Sunshine of Your Love." But this wasn't the polished, radio-friendly version Cream had recorded. This was raw, dirty, and furious. Jimmy played it with a violent down-picking style, digging his pick into the strings as if trying to snap them. It was heavier than heavy metal, before heavy metal even had a name. Mitch Mitchell exploded into the drum pattern, a thundering tom-tom beat that mimicked Ginger Baker's tribal style but added a jazz-inflected chaos that was pure experience. Noel Redding locked in. The song wasn't just a cover, it was a possession. What the hell is he doing? The scream tore through the control room. The producer jumped out of his chair. "That's not Hey Joe. He's playing Cream. He's playing a tribute. I don't care what he's playing, look at the clock." The clock was the enemy. They had exactly 2 minutes left before the hard cut to the news. "Sunshine of Your Love" was a long song. A jamming song. It didn't fit the slot. "Tell him to stop," the director barked into the floor manager's headset. "Cut him off." Down on the floor manager was in a state of sheer panic. He ran towards the stage, just out of the camera's frame, waving his hands wildly across his throat. "Stop. Cut. Finish." Jimmy saw him. He looked right at the frantic little man in the suit. And then, he did something beautiful. He closed his eyes, tilted his head back, and smiled. He turned his back on the floor manager and walked towards his amp, coaxing a squeal of feedback that drowned out the shouting. He was in the zone now. He was jamming with ghosts. The studio audience, initially confused, began to wake up. This wasn't the polite pop song they expected. This was energy. This was rebellion. Feet started tapping. Heads started nodding. The backing singers, realizing they had no part in this instrumental storm, simply stepped back and watched in awe. For 2 minutes, Jimi Hendrix owned the BBC. He played lead lines that spiraled into the stratosphere, bending notes until they screamed for mercy. He was rewriting the rules of television engagement in real time. He wasn't an employee, he was an occupier. 1 minute to news. 1 minute. The voice in the gallery was hysterical. "Fade him. Fade audio. We can't fade him yet, it'll look like a technical fault. He's not stopping, Stanley. He's going into a solo." And he was. Jimmy launched into an improvised solo, a flurry of notes that sounded like a machine gun firing into a kaleidoscope. He was completely lost in the music, honoring his friend Eric Clapton with every ounce of his soul, oblivious to the bureaucratic meltdown happening upstairs. He had turned the Happy Lulu show into a wake for the psychedelic dream, and he was the master of ceremonies. The clock on the wall of the control gallery was merciless. It read 18 hours 2 minutes and 45 seconds. The evening news was scheduled for 18 hours and 3 minutes. 15 seconds. That was the margin between a national broadcast and a national disaster. Down on the studio floor, Jimi Hendrix was still soaring, his eyes closed, lost in the intricate, blues-soaked labyrinth of the Sunshine of Your Love solo. He was miles away from White City, he was in a delta of pure sound, communing with the spirit of the just-deceased Cream. Upstairs, the decision was made with the cold brutality of a firing squad. "Cut him," the producer ordered. His voice was flat, defeated, but final. "Fade audio? Or cut video?" the Vision mixer asked, his hand hovering over the console. "Kill it all. Go to black. Cue the continuity announcer." On stage, Jimi sensed the shift in the air pressure before it happened. He saw the floor manager stop waving his arms and simply stand there, hands on hips, shaking his head in resignation. The frantic energy of the crew dissolved into a sullen realization that the train had officially left the tracks. Jimi opened his eyes. He didn't look panicked. He didn't look apologetic. He looked at the chaos he had caused and found it amusing. As the band hit the final, thunderous crescendo, a chaotic tumble of drums and feedback, Jimi didn't bother with a clean ending. He didn't bring the song to a resolved tonic chord. He simply stopped playing. The sudden silence in the room was heavier than the music had been. The feedback from his Marshall stack lingered for a second, a dying electronic wail that sounded like a wounded animal. Jimi leaned into the microphone, his voice calm, almost bored, delivering the epitaph for the evening. "We're being put off the air." Zap. The screen went black in millions of homes. The transmission feed from Studio 4 was severed. A second later, the polite, plummy voice of the BBC continuity announcer filled the void, apologizing for the slight disruption before seamlessly introducing the news. The revolution was televised, but the execution was censored. Inside the studio, the reality of what had just happened settled like dust after an explosion. The audience sat in stunned silence. They had been promised a pop song, they had been given a riot. Lulu stood by the side of the stage, her professional smile finally slipping. She looked confused, holding her microphone like a useless prop. The dancers, frozen in their sequined outfits, whispered among themselves. Then, the doors to the studio burst open. The producers descended from the gallery like avenging angels. Their faces were flushed with adrenaline and rage. They marched across the polished floor towards the small circular stage where the Jimi Hendrix Experience was casually unplugging their instruments. What the bloody hell was that? Stanley Dorfman, the producer, demanded, his voice echoing in the cavernous room. "You went over time. You cut the news. Do you have any idea what you've done?" Jimi looked up from his pedal board. He slowly removed his guitar strap, coiling the cable with deliberate slowness. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't engage in the shouting match. He simply shrugged, a gesture of supreme indifference. "It's just music, man," he murmured. "We wanted to play for Eric." "You were booked to play, Hey Joe," the producer shouted, pointing a finger at the setlist taped to the floor. "We had a contract." "Yeah, well," Mitch Mitchell chimed in, twirling a drumstick, "we decided, Hey Joe was boring. And frankly, so is this show." The audacity was breathtaking. In the hierarchical world of 1969 Britain, you didn't talk back to a BBC producer. You apologized. You begged for forgiveness. But these three men, fueled by talent, exhaustion, and hashish, existed outside the hierarchy. They were untouchable. "You'll never work here again," the producer hissed, delivering the ultimate threat in his arsenal. "I'll see to it personally. You are banned from the BBC. For life." Jimmy smiled. It was a genuine, warm smile, devoid of malice. "That's cool," he said softly. "I didn't like the food in the canteen anyway." The band packed their gear in record time. The atmosphere in the dressing room was no longer tense, it was jubilant. They felt the high of the prankster who has pulled off the ultimate heist. They had hijacked the national airwaves, paid tribute to their friends, and given the middle finger to the establishment, all in under 4 minutes. They walked out of the television center through the artist's entrance. The heavy glass doors swung shut behind them, sealing the sterile world of the BBC back inside its concrete shell. Outside, the London night was freezing. The wind cut through their velvet jackets, but they didn't care. They were laughing. Mitch was reenacting the floor manager's panic, waving his arms and making choking noises. Noel was lighting a cigarette, shaking his head in disbelief. Jimmy walked a few paces ahead, looking up at the gray sky. He felt lighter. The weight of "Hey Joe" was gone, at least for tonight. He had reclaimed his agency. He hadn't been the dancing monkey, he had been the lion. That night, the BBC phones rang off the hook. Angry viewers complained about the noise, the disrespect, the long-haired louts who had delayed the news. But among the complaints, there were other calls. Teenagers calling in to ask, "What was that song?" Musicians calling to say, "Did you see that?" The footage of that performance was nearly lost. The BBC, in its infinite wisdom, often wiped tapes to save money. But this clip survived. It survived to become a testament to artistic integrity. When we watch it today, we don't see a scandal. We see a moment of pure, unadulterated truth. We see Jimi Hendrix, at the height of his powers, refusing to compromise. We see the moment when rock and roll stopped being just entertainment and became a statement. It was a declaration that the artist answers to a higher authority than the producer, the clock, or the network. The artist answers to the muse. Jimi Hendrix would be dead 20 months later. The BBC would go on for decades. But on that cold January night in 1969, for 3 glorious, feedback-drenched minutes, the wild man won. He stopped the clock. He broke the machine. And he did it all for a friend. The amplifiers have finally cooled down, and the suits at the BBC have gone back to their tea and biscuits. But the question remains, was Jimmy arrogant for hijacking a live broadcast, or was he the only sane person in the building, fighting for artistic integrity? I want to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below that I read every single one of them. And if this story took you back, even for a moment, please like this video and share it with a friend who understands what real music sounds like. Until next time, keep the feedback ringing. I'll see you in the next chapter.